Hello, my name is Silas Doyle.
And my name is Eamon Doyle. I'm Silas's dad.
Today I'm going to be discussing the theme, character development, and how the characters advance the plot of The Body Snatcher by Robert Louis Stevenson. This is a book that that follows the character Fetz and his friend/colleague MacFarlane. Fetz begins as a surgeon, dissecting bodies with his classroom and on the side by himself, and he slowly comes to realize that the way that he's accumulating these bodies is not exactly legal. The theme that I've deduced is that it is the downward spiral of Fetz's morality. The first event in the story begins with Fetz simply dissecting bodies with his students, and later in the night, after he is done working, he meets two strange men who give him a body. This is seen as a very normal thing in the story, until one day Fetz receives a body of someone that he knew was alive that day. Now,
okay. Let me just stop you right there for a second.
Okay.
Try not to hit the rig.
Okay.
Because we hear that. Okay. I know you don't hear that, but I do.
Okay.
Anyways, so you say that it's a normal thing, but this is, correct me if I'm wrong, this is sort of the beginning of this kind of forensic work, right? Like up until this point, there hasn't really been historically a science where they're taking cadavers and they're cutting them apart, right?
Yes, the only way that they could legally receive bodies back then was from prisons, penitentiaries of dead inmates. Mm-hmm. They were allowed to dissect those, or if families offered a body up that was, say, their child or a family member that they were willing to donate to this research. But it was not a very broad field of study yet. It was pretty basic.
Okay. So similar into what we have today in the sense that you don't have to have an autopsy for somebody if you don't want to, right? Mm-mm. So if it's a family member and you say no autopsy, then the court has to respect that.
Yes.
But if you do say it's fine, whatever, and that you can even, as we've seen on like you don't have your driver's license yet, but on driver's license, you can have a donor card. So you can donate your organs or your body.
I see.
If you die for any odd reason. But it's the beginning sort of this forensic science.
Yes.
In the way that we think of it now.
Yes, and because it's very basic and there's just been this sudden outburst in interest, this explosion in interest, you might say, that there aren't enough bodies to go around. There aren't enough dead prison inmates for all of these new surgeons to be practicing on, especially Fetz, who has a class that he needs to give these bodies up to.
Right, because he's a teacher and he's teaching other students who are fascinated by this just the same way that he is, but they don't have the raw material.
Yeah.
As much as they need.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so I just wanted to, kind of touch on that a little bit.
Yes.
Okay. So he's getting bodies and he realizes he's not getting them by the most legal of means.
Yes. So the two strange men that I mentioned before, they have been giving him bodies over time for him and his class. And he notices that they bring a body that has the face and body of a young woman that he knew was alive the day before, in virtually perfect condition. So he starts putting pieces together while they're giving the body over and asking for money, and he puts the pieces together and figures out that they probably killed her on the street.
Right.
So he has the choice to either turn them into the authorities or continue with his work. But before he can even make that choice, the men notice that he's thinking about it. And I'm assuming, in the book, it seems as though they notice that he knows who that is. So they tell him that basically all of the bodies that they've been giving him have been these illegally taken bodies. So if he turns them in, he's already part of it. I don't know if that's necessarily blackmail.
It is in a way.
Because you're using information to keep information, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of blackmail. Like, it depends, right? The legal system, I don't know the legal system of, 1800s England?
Yeah, it's pretty old.
So, I mean, I don't know what they would have done if they would have argued, like in our court system, if that's the first time that he finds that out and he stops and he turns those guys in and he turns himself in and he said, look, this is what's been happening, then he would probably get some sort of slap on the wrist or something.
Right.
It wouldn't be a big punishment. Back then, in, different country, different legal system, I don't know how that would have gone. But yes, essentially, these two guys are, blackmailing him a little bit because they're telling him, hey, all these bodies that we've been giving you, guess where they've been coming from? So, and then he decides that he's just going to keep going, right?
Yeah. So, as Dad mentioned, he continues doing these after the blackmail and the continuation of bodies that he can study and all of that. He does continue to do this. So he lets the bodies keep coming in. I don't think he recognizes anyone from that point forward.
Okay.
That people have been bringing in, but he does still continue to do them, knowing that they were probably innocent people who were killed on the street.
Right, and that first gal tips him off.
Yep.
And that's just a piece of the story, an important piece of the story, for us to as readers to view. Those two guys are those characters that we know, in the story, or
I don't think so. They mention one overarching character whose name is Mr. K, who I didn't talk to you about. He's not very important, so it didn't seem like very important to add, but it's a nod to real life because the Body Snatcher is fiction, where maybe I can't remember if it is based on some real events. It might be, but it's a fiction novel. But Mr. K is a real person. It's a nod to a real person, and he was, I think, a surgeon who illegally took bodies and dissected them. And killed people on the street. So that's a part of history that's actually true.
Okay, so Robert Louis Stevenson is writing, sort of weaving that in. So he's not making Mr. K be Fetz.
Yes.
But he's nodding to that there's a little bit of history.
Right.
An actual event that happened.
Yes. So Mr. K is kind of a background figure who's employing all of this, who's paying the men to go and get the bodies, and then the men are paying him back for this whole organizational piece. So it's kind of a nod that Fetz might be part of something bigger,
right?
Like something where other institutions are into it. The other institutions are receiving illegal bodies,
and a historical nod, like you said,
and
Mr.
a historical nod. So
right.
you never know his full name. He's just called Mr. K, but I think his first name. Historically is Knox or something like that. Dr. Knox. I forget what it is.
Interesting. So he makes this, Robert Louis Stevenson makes this nod to an actual historical character, but the person who we're following, the character who we're following is Fetz. And so that's, who we're trying to sort of flush out here in terms of character and theme.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Keep going. Yeah.
So, this continues on for a while. Fetz receiving these assumed illegally, taken bodies. They're either being killed on the street. They're being killed on the street.
Illegally obtained.
Illegally obtained. Yes. And the next big event doesn't happen for a little bit. It happens pretty quickly in the book. It doesn't happen for, I think it's a couple months that Fetz continues doing this.
Okay. So fast forward.
Yes. Fast forward. McFarlane, who is, as I mentioned before, Fett's colleague, he also helps provide with bodies, and I think in the book they mention that he's the senior supervisor in Fett's class, so Fetz refers to him if he needs to change curriculum or whatever.
I didn't realize that he was in a position of power over Fetz in some way. Oh, okay. Oh, that's good to know.
So he... McFarlane invites Fetz to a bar, and there Fetz meets a man named Gray. Now, we never really get a full understanding of why this is, but Gray has some kind of superiority over McFarlane. In a way, like I said, that's never explained.
Right.
But he keeps making McFarlane order drinks for everyone in the bar, and keeps making him use his own money to order Gray food and stuff, like controlling him. And obviously, it really pisses McFarlane off.
Right.
And Gray makes McFarlane pay for Fett's drinks and all of this stuff. So by the end of this, McFarlane is just like totally wiped out and really pissed off.
Right.
And they all leave. And Fetz, I think they say Fetz goes back to his house and he just is knocked out. Like he's just completely done, drunk, silly.
Right.
The next day, McFarlane comes in with another body, and you kind of already assume who it is, but you don't know for sure yet. And he brings the body in, and there's a whole conversation between them of McFarlane wanting Fetz to open the bag, and Fetz doesn't want to because he this has never happened before. It's like asking somebody to open your groceries for you and be like, check what's inside. It doesn't make sense.
Right.
Why you would mention that. So this goes on it's a little argument, and then Fetz finally reveals it, and it's Gray. So you piece together that McFarlane killed Gray. You don't exactly know why. Maybe it was something with Dr. K or whatever, but Gray is dead. And McFarlane makes Fetz dissect Gray. Now, again, he had a choice. Now McFarlane and the other two men have killed a woman he knew,
Right.
and somebody that he had just met at a bar, and
Right.
who was, he assumed, innocent.
Right.
He has another opportunity to divert from that path and go on a better one and knock all of this down, go to the authorities and understand it.
Right.
But, right, this is where that mindset comes in. He starts to think, well, I've already done it multiple times.
Right.
I've already agreed to it. If I do it now, I'll probably get in trouble, so I may as well continue doing it.
Right. Right.
Right? It's a slippery slope that he keeps falling down, and he can't climb back up. It's very difficult. So
we've got, this is interesting because, when we talked about this before, these are pieces that we didn't go over, that there's like I don't know if you would call it a criminal enterprise or not. I guess they never really explain it, but you've got Mr. K, who's sort of at the top, and then it would seem that Gray is under him and that McFarlane is then under him. And, Fetz is just sort of, a pawn in this whole thing.
because McFarlane, what they reference in the story is that McFarlane has a lot of the smarts, but Fetz is really good with the practicality. He is a very, very good surgeon. He has very steady hands. He's very good at what he does. And that's why Fetz allows him to do it instead of McFarlane doing it himself. That's why that happens.
So McFarlane is also a doctor.
Yes.
He's a surgeon. Interesting. We never know if Gray is a surgeon or not.
No.
Okay.
We assume because it's in their field of study, it would make sense that all three of them would be meeting. And we never even learn what the meeting was about, like why Gray invited Fetz to this. There wasn't any... There are some parts that you don't really fully understand. And it does make you think. It also makes you wonder if the story was left out in some parts, because there are some parts that just don't make sense, like that one.
Right. Well, I guess with a short story, you don't have the, you don't have the luxury of sort of filling all of those pieces out. And so, he seems like he's leaving things a little ambiguous, in terms of these kinds of details. He just gives you like a little thing, like, because you don't really know. He calls him Mr. K, but like you said, it's the possibility that he was based on another doctor, an actual doctor. So it's hard to say if this is all doctors and they're just doing this, or if there's like some actual like real criminals, who are sort of then merging and converging with these doctors, to get them these bodies. There's money being exchanged, right?
Yes.
Like when this is happening?
Yes, so Fetz is paying off these men, and there's an exchange of money, and what we would assume is Fetz using the bodies for research.
Right.
Or practice.
Right.
One of the two.
So he's definitely making all the wrong choices.
Yes. Pretty much at every turn that we get to see in the book, he makes the wrong choice. Or, in this case, the easy choice, and the morally wrong one.
Right. Do we ever get a sense of why? Is there ever like an internal dialogue or anything that we see in the story of him sort of self-examining, or is it just, I guess I'm doing this, like, other than, like you said, other than him saying, well, I'm already in so deep that that's all, I'm just going to keep going? Yes.
You notice that in the beginning. That's where that character development starts to come in, except it's kind of, it's not as much development as it is the opposite. He's wearing away, because in the beginning, where you see the woman's name was Jane Galbraith.
Okay.
when he first discovers that this woman is someone that he had seen yesterday, the body that he's working on,
Right.
he does have that internal battle inside his head. He's thinking there while he's about to exchange money with them, like, should I be doing this? Why am I doing this? This doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I really should not be doing this. But between the blackmailing and the pressure, and Robert Louis Stevenson describes Fetz as kind of naive. He's not exactly the smartest protagonist.
Oh, okay. So he's a little wet behind the ears. He's
yes.
not quite got. Okay, because you know that's an important piece, I think, because you know maybe somebody older with a little bit more experience, a little wiser, you know, might just stop and say, "What the heck are you guys? What the heck are you guys doing? You know, why are you going and getting these bodies and doing all this thing versus, you know, just not doing that."
Yeah.
So it's these kind of that he's a young guy and he's naive. Mm-hmm. Well, at least I mean he has somewhat of an internal, you know, back and forth that first time.
Yep.
You know, but I guess that's the first step of Stevenson kind of showing you the direction that where he's at, and that he's then you see later and later and later it
exactly.
goes less down, less and less, down and down.
Yeah, so each time, I don't think he has barely any of an internal struggle when the Gray's body comes in. It might be confusion and then some anger, but it quickly dissipates. It's gone.
Right.
And then he kind of just accepts that what's happening is supposed to be happening. And he continues forward with that. And the final example shows just how deteriorated his morality has become.
Right.
Because what happens next is McFarlane decides that they should go get a body from a local graveyard. And I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, the reason that they do this is because they don't want to arouse suspicion in the village that they're living in by multiple people dying every day.
Right. On the street.
Exactly.
It's getting a little too much heat.
Yeah, a little bit too much heat for them to handle or deal with. So they decide to go to a graveyard and continue their research using bodies from there. So they get a carriage and they head off to there, and they dig up this body, which is, I think, an old farm woman who had just recently died.
Okay.
Very recently.
Okay. So still relatively fresh, so to speak.
And it was in a coffin too. They did that. So you assume that she was relatively wealthy. She was buried in a coffin. That doesn't really matter. Just a side note.
Right.
She was in a coffin. So the body was really well preserved. There wasn't any dirt. There weren't any bugs. There was nothing. It was just like if you had a body and you had killed someone or someone had just died and you used that.
Right. You just brought it there directly. Right.
So before this all transpires, Fetz mentions it to McFarlane. So he comes up with this idea to go to the graveyard and get these bodies. Because McFarlane, what happens is McFarlane starts to let little bits out to be like, yeah, people are starting to get suspicious and we should be doing that. And Fetz, right, he's pretty drunk. He comes out with this outburst and he recommends this idea. And McFarlane goes along with it. Now, McFarlane is still the leading entity here.
Right.
But Fetz had a good idea and he decided to go through with it.
Right. Well, that's interesting because that is, I mean, that's him really fully turning the corner. Like, you know, if we think of the first body as questionable, and then the second body as, well, I don't know, but I'm already in really deep, to the third one where he makes the suggestion.
Yeah.
It's not like McFarlane says, hey, we're going to go dig somebody up. McFarlane's like, man, there's all this heat, you know, from all these people that are getting killed on the street. Wink, wink. And then Fetz is like, well, let's just go get somebody from the graveyard. Like, that's him going. Yeah. That's him just committing. Yeah. Going down this path.
It seems as though he's completely agreed with, or maybe not agreed with necessarily, but come to terms with what's happening and decided that he doesn't need to continue fighting it or disagreeing with his own mind, that he should just accept it and continue with what he's doing. So that's the last piece of the downward spiral. And It seems as though Robert Louis Stevenson put in a little bit to scare you and also kind of as a punishment for McFarlane and Fetz. Because what happens is after they dig up the body and put it in a body bag and start going home, as they're about halfway to their village, the bag starts to move.
Right.
And at first, Fetz and I think McFarlane notices it because Fetz is still a little drunk. McFarlane notices that it's moving. He assumes it's just the carriage. They continue. It happens again. Now McFarlane is starting to question what's happening. They continue moving, and then it starts shaking. And McFarlane tells Fetz to take off the top part, which I'm assuming is the bag cover, to see who it is. And instead of the frail old woman that they had, was the large gray, who Fetz had recently dissected.
Right.
So he was already gone.
Right.
There was no way that he could have gotten in that coffin. They put a woman in that bag.
Sure.
So it's kind of the what would you call it? The paranormal part of it, I guess you could say, or the mysterious part of it that doesn't make any logical sense, just to scare you.
Right. So, I was thinking about this the other day, and it's interesting that you mentioned that Fetz was drunk. I was, because I couldn't quite figure out, from my perspective, the last time that we talked about this, I thought that McFarlane was the one who was making the suggestion and Fetz was still going along, but the twist or the turn of him making the suggestion, he's drunk. And then I think it's interesting because you get to that end part where, it's gray, and he's still drunk. Like that there could be a, what do you call it? Like a hallucination because he's under the influence.
Oh, you mean Fetz is still drunk?
Yeah. Yeah. So that, that being drunk, that kind of works into that. I mean, the fact that,
right.
What's his name?
McFarlane
isn't.
He's not intoxicated.
Right. Sort of makes it like right on the edge of like, whoa, this like could really be real. Because you could argue that somebody who's the two guys who were drunk, could come up, ending up, seeing any kind of thing, depending on how hammered they are.
Yep.
But, that one guy is and one guy isn't sort of lends, some level of authenticity to what's happening, even though we know that it clearly is not possible.
Yes.
Here's the thing I wanted to ask. Why do you think it's gray? Why isn't it the first gal who he knew? Why are they using gray as the thing that comes back to scare them?
I actually have I don't know.
If you're gonna speculate,
Well, if I was speculating, in my opinion, if I was writing the book, it would make a lot more sense for Fett's punishment to be someone that he knew, such as Jane Galbraith, someone who he knew not super well. They don't describe her as like a close friend in the story, but someone that he knew at least.
Right.
He never knew Gray until that night at the bar.
And that was it.
It was one day that he knew him, and then he was dead. I don't necessarily know why Robert Louis Stevenson decided to put Gray there. It may have been a number of things. It may been that Jane Galbraith was a woman, and that she may have looked like the woman that they had dug up, and that Gray was a man. May not have stood out. I honestly don't know. From a reader's perspective, it would have made a lot more sense for it to be Jane Galbraith. It would have had a more stunning impact as you're following Fetz.
Right.
If you were following McFarlane and you got some background into who Gray was, because we know that Gray was McFarlane's superior in some way.
Right.
So if we had been from McFarlane's perspective and we had realized, oh, okay, he just killed his boss basically, and then his boss came back to haunt him.
Right.
It could also be because it was the most recent body.
Right. Yeah, that one kind of tripped me up a little bit when I thought about that, because I guess the thing that I would ask is, did McFarlane know, what was the gal's name?
Jane Galbraith.
Did he know her in any capacity? Did they ever allude to?
I don't think so. He might have, because Jane Galbraith attended the school that Fetz taught at.
Oh.
That's how he knew her.
Oh. Was he one of his students,
I don't think so.
but was on the campus, knew her
Yes.
that way. So it's possible that McFarlane knew her too. Mm-hmm. But we never really get a sense of that.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah. I just wondered why Stevenson picked Gray, but there's potential for McFarlane to know Jane. There's a clear indication that he knows Gray, that they both know Gray because of that incident. So that kind of makes some sense. But I just didn't know if there was anything that really stood out to you thematically about why Stevenson would pick Gray.
No, I don't know. It's something that I have also contemplated, why it would have been Gray, where, as I mentioned before, it makes a lot more sense from the reader for it to be someone more impactful.
Right. So it seems like excuse me. It seems like Fetz's character develops, but it develops in a negative direction.
Yes. So if you were to take development as seeing more of who he is, as development in that way, where it's like an image developing in front of you, he does develop. You can see that he definitely develop as in change.
Right.
He definitely changes.
Right. Just downward.
Yes, badly.
Right. It's fascinating, that it was just so easy, that there wasn't more hang-ups or strings or things that he, and I don't know, like maybe, you get into that, that profession, and I don't know if he's thinking about his students, if he's, thinking about himself and his, his legacy, or what it is that is motivating him to keep doing this, knowing that, the bodies are illegal, like that they're coming, and
Right.
that they've probably been illegal for a while.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah, the first one with Jane Galbraith, that first example, is really where it hits him. It's very impactful because, right, he's still a relatively morally good person.
Right.
And he understands that her dying on the street was obviously wrong. She was murdered.
Right.
But one thing that I didn't mention is, right, we were talking about that internal battle in Fett's mind and how it slowly disappears. Mm-hmm. It disappears because of him. Like, he starts telling himself to stop. And I mentioned that in the paper that I wrote, where he just blocks everything out. So he just continues focusing on the next body that he has to get, the payment. He lives his life very like it's like numbered. Like, okay, I have to do this next, and then I have to do this next, and then this last thing, and then I go to sleep, and then I start it all over again. His days are they seem to be very planned, like he's trying to ignore those things, which works.
Right.
Eventually to where he doesn't have to worry about that anymore.
Right. He just basically talks himself out of the guilt and the moral part of it, and
Yep.
and has a very systematic sort of day and existence that's focused around just dissecting and teaching and having his students do the same work. It's kind of creepy, in a way.
Yeah, the horror or the thriller behind it doesn't as much come from the ending or the whole idea that they're murdering people on the street. Like, you never get any action. You never get to see or read an action scene where McFarlane is killing someone. You never
Right.
get that kind of like modern-esque horror where it's like there's somebody with a knife and they're stabbing someone.
Right.
The horror more comes from the fact where you understand how fast he's deteriorating. That's why the theme is so important to this book, because once you understand that, it's scary. Not exactly that they're taking unlawful bodies and dissecting them or killing people on the streets, but that Fetz as a human being is able to go from 100 to basically 0 in months.
Yeah. And in some ways, Stevenson not including these scenes, I think as a writer, it points to the fact that what he thinks is important is what's on the page, and what's on the page is Fetz's morality just going down the tubes. You know, we don't need to see any of that stuff because it's not really that important. It doesn't really play into what's going on with Fetz, and you know that he's just turning into an awful human being who just has no regard for human life.
Right.
You know, thinks that whatever his calling is more, or that his job is more important. Yeah. Eesh. Not a pleasant character.
No.
Okay, well that I think that sounds pretty good. Thanks for talking with me, Si.
Yep, of course.
Sweet. And we'll wrap this up.
Cool.